Today we're going to tear down the anatomy of a disaster. It's a story about technology, it's a story about human factors, and it's about a split-second decision that would have consequences that rippled across the entire aviation industry. This is the story of Emirates Flight 521. But first things first, it's really important to frame this the right way. As the official report from the UAE's investigators says, this is not about pointing fingers. It's not about blame. The only reason to do an investigation like this is to figure out what went wrong so we can prevent it from ever happening again. And that's exactly the spirit of what we're doing here today. So let's set the scene. Picture this. It's August 3rd, 2016. You've got a massive Boeing 777, one of the biggest and safest planes in the sky, with 300 people on board. It's on its final approach into the bustling hub of Dubai. Then, in the very last seconds of the flight, the pilots make a critical decision. One that ends with the plane in a fiery wreck on the runway. So the question is, how on earth did this happen?
To really get to the why, we first have to unpack the what. We've got to look at those final critical minutes of the flight and a maneuver, a totally standard maneuver that went so terribly wrong.
Now, if you look at the flight crew, you can see right away, these guys were not rookies, not by a long shot. I mean, combined, they had over 15,000 hours in the air. The commander alone had more than 5,000 hours just on this type of aircraft. But the investigation pointed out one crucial little detail. This was the very first time these two pilots had ever flown together.
So as they're coming into Dubai, the conditions are, well, they're tricky. The temperature on the ground is a blistering 41 degrees Celsius. And more importantly, the cockpit systems are flashing alerts for potential wind shear. And if you're a pilot, that's something you take very, very seriously. It's a sudden, unpredictable, and dangerous change in wind.
The plane is sinking a bit too fast, the runway's coming up quick, and the commander makes the call. At just 54 feet above the ground, that is incredibly low, he decides to abort. He calls for a go-around, which is just a standard procedure. You power up, climb away, and come around for another try. But what happened in the next few seconds was anything but standard.
The plane slammed into the runway, skidded for what felt like an eternity, and then burst into flames. Now, miraculously, every single person on board managed to evacuate. But it begs the question, how does a routine go-around end with a completely destroyed airplane? To get that, we need to look at how a series of small, almost insignificant failures can line up to create one massive catastrophe.
You know, investigators have this great way of visualizing it, called the Swiss cheese model. Think about it. Every layer of safety, the pilot, the technology, the training procedures, is like a slice of Swiss cheese. It's mostly solid, but it's got a few holes in it. Normally, the solid part of one slice covers the holes in the slice behind it. But every once in a while, the holes align perfectly, and that's when a disaster slips right through. Let's look at the slices for Flight 521.
So, the first slice, the first hole, was about human perception. It was what was going on inside the pilot's head. The commander started the go-round, pulling back on the controls to bring the nose up. In his mind, in his mental model, the plane was still flying. He later said he had tunnel vision, just laser-focused on that one procedure. But here's the thing, his brain and his own senses were playing a trick on him.
He was almost certainly experiencing something called a somatogravic illusion. It's this wild sensory trap. See, when your body accelerates forward really fast, the fluid in your inner ear sloshes back. Your brain interprets that signal as you tilting your head up. So for a pilot, it can feel like the plane is pitching up way more than it actually is. It's a known risk, and it's especially dangerous during a powerful go-around like this one.
And that feeling, that illusion, leads us right to the next hole in the cheese, a technological one. Okay, so to get that full go-around power, the pilot hits the TO/GA switches. That stands for takeoff/go-around. The commander did this. He pushed the button. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that the plane's wheels had just kissed the runway for a couple of seconds. And on a Boeing 777, if those wheels are down for more than 2 seconds, the TO/GA switches are inhibited. They're locked out. The auto throttle does not engage. So he pitched the nose up to climb, but the engines never got the message to spool up. The plane clawed its way back into the air with no power, stalled, and fell right back onto the runway.
So you have to ask, right? Why didn't the pilots know about this little quirk? And that brings us to our third and final hole, organizational factors. The investigation discovered that the airline's own safety data showed that its pilots were struggling with go-arounds. They were often being, quote, poorly flown. In fact, it had been a special point of emphasis in training for 7 years. And yet, the specific danger of this TO/GA inhibit logic after a brief touchdown, it was never identified as a threat. It wasn't something they explicitly trained for. All the holes had just lined up perfectly.
So in the moments right after the crash, two completely different battles begin to rage. One is a very real, very physical fight against fire and chaos on the runway. And the other is a digital fight, a battle to control the narrative and manage a massive global crisis online.
First, let's talk about the human toll on board. Getting all 300 people off a burning plane is nothing short of incredible, but it wasn't a clean escape. You can see here, 4 of the cabin crew had serious injuries, and nearly 30 other people had minor ones. It's a real testament to how violent that impact was and just how frantic that evacuation must have been.
But tragically, the story has a final, heartbreaking chapter. As dozens of firefighters were bravely battling this enormous blaze, the plane's center fuel tank exploded, and that explosion tragically killed one of those firefighters. He was the only fatality of the entire event.
The investigation also took a hard look at the emergency response itself. And what it found was that the firefighting tactics were, well, they were flawed. This diagram from the report shows the problem perfectly. You had some teams spraying fire-suppressing foam on one part of the fire, while other teams were spraying water nearby. The problem is the water was actually breaking down the foam blanket, making it less effective and hampering the whole effort.
Now let's contrast that chaos on the ground with what was happening in the digital world. While the fire was still literally burning, Emirates' crisis communications team was launching this incredibly sophisticated plan. They immediately started monitoring media and social channels all over the world in dozens of languages. They weren't just reacting, they were actively hunting down misinformation and engaging directly with concerned families.
And this quote from an Emirates VP really says it all. They were using data, in real time, to shape their response. This let them get ahead of the story, fight back against rumors, and manage what could have been an absolute reputational nightmare. It was a masterclass in modern crisis comms.
The crash of Flight 521 was really a textbook case of a systemic failure. But from that failure, from that wreckage, came an incredibly powerful legacy. A fundamental rewriting of the rules of aviation safety.
So how do you fix a problem this complex? A problem that involves human psychology, a weird technological quirk, and gaps in training? Well, you have to go back to the very source code of aviation, the regulations that say how airplanes are designed and built in the first place.
When the UAE's final report on this accident came out, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Its recommendations didn't just point fingers at the airline, they went all the way to the top, to the big global regulators like the American FAA. The findings in that report directly led to the official action you're seeing here.
So what happened? The FAA put together a kind of dream team, experts from manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus, from pilot unions, from other regulators. And their one job was to solve the go-around problem once and for all.
And what they found is, frankly, pretty startling. Get this, before this accident, a high-powered go-around with all engines working was not a specific maneuver that had to be formally tested and evaluated when certifying a new plane. It seems obvious, right? But it wasn't a rule. The working group's biggest recommendation was to change that, and that is the real legacy of Flight 521. Now every new airliner that gets designed has to prove that this exact scenario is safe, that it's manageable, and that it accounts for the intense pressure the pilots are under.
You know, it's a somber truth, but the aviation rulebook is often written in the aftermath of tragedy. The story of Emirates 521 is such a powerful reminder of that. It's a complex, messy story of how people, technology, and organizations can fail, but it's also ultimately a story of learning from that failure, and in doing so, making the skies just a little bit safer for every single one of us.